Welcome to the Good Reading Podcast, proudly sponsored by Book People Gift Cards. A Book People gift card is the perfect gift for readers of all ages. Simply order your gift card online at bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au. Redeem in any one of over 500 bookshops across Australia. Visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au. Quentin Beresford is an adjunct professor at Sunshine Coast University. He's the author of The Rise and Fall of Guns Limited, Adani and the War Over Coal, and Wounded Country, which won the 2022 Queensland Premier's Award for a work of state significance. Today I'm talking to Quentin Beresford about his new book, Rogue Corporations, Inside Australia's Biggest Business Scandals. Quentin Beresford, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Greg.
Rogue Corporations details the scandalous life of business of corporations in Australia. You say there's a plethora of corporate scandals to choose from. What are the qualifying factors for inclusion in your list?
Yeah, that presented a bit of a problem. But firstly, I think we should acknowledge the range and depth of these scandals over the past 40 years. They've just rolled through, and they often have devastating and ruinous consequences for people. And it did strike me that it was a systemic part of our corporate life in Australia and the way our economy functions. So I was focusing on what I thought was a real problem. Now, so the second question is then, which ones do you choose? There could have been 30. I chose 13. I briefly mentioned 3 or 4 others that were tangential to some of the bigger scandals. And so the selection of 13 came down to, firstly, I wanted to span across the history of the scandals from the 80s to the present day. So that meant I wanted to go back and revisit some of the better known ones, the collapse of Bond Corporation, Geoffrey, Edelsten, Christopher Skase, because they were part of that phenomenon of the 80s that we did tend to corral as the decade of greed and then moved on. I don't see it like that. Then I wanted scandals that, really had big impacts on people. So HIH, the collapse of HIH insurance, basically brought the insurance industry in Australia to a halt until the government had to, reconfigure it. Then I wanted scandals where there were official inquiries. Then you can get into, the submissions to those inquiries, the public hearings. That kind of material often gets overlooked in the day-to-day journalism because, the caravan of the media moves on. That people like me can come back and have a good look at all that information, and there's just a plethora of it. So I think they were the criteria: the size of the scandals, the ruinous consequences, the historic spread, and the availability of information.
Rogue Corporation sets out to, as you say, explore the corporate scandals as a continuous phenomenon of Australian society over the past 4 decades. Now, one word stands out for me there, and that's the word continuous. So that suggests there's a corporate culture of malpractice or whatever it might be, which we accept in some way, including by government and its regulators.
Yeah, exactly. And look, I'm not trying to say there was a golden age of corporate life. I mean, obviously capitalism has both great benefits to society and, can have a dark side. We're all aware of that. From my perspective, the continuous nature of it really accompanies the deregulation of the economy and the privatisation of the economy from the 80s onwards. And what we know about that is, of course, it opened up the Australian economy to international forces, made it more productive. Keating always gives a good spin on why this was necessary. But I think what was under-acknowledged at the time is that this gave incentive for corporations to pursue maximising their shareholder returns. And then we had the rise of these cowboy kind of corporate leaders. And we did put a full stop on the 80s when the business model fell over. These guys were corporate raiders, as we all remember. They were borrowing eye-watering amounts from banks. And Bond, of course, was the par exemplar of this kind of model. And, of course, the 87 stock market crash came along and wiped most of these guys out. A couple of them went to jail. But what really happens is, of course, the scandals keep coming. It was only a few years later that HIH imploded. And then on top of HIH was the James Hardie scandal, where they all lied about the medical fund set up to handle asbestos cases. And so it rolled on. So it seemed to me there was never this period in the new deregulated economy where there weren't scandals. Now, I don't think deregulation and privatisation is the whole story, but I think that is a continuous thread in the story.
And now it seems that the Australia's scandalous corporate landscape is populated by a gallery of what you call lovable rogues. History tells us that they are more rogue than lovable, but what characteristics do they share? And why do we continue to be so enamoured with the idea of a lovable rogue?
Yeah, look, it's just so fascinating to me, the personality characteristics of these people at head corporations that career into scandal. And I do think they share certain characteristics. They've got great drive, they've got great energy, they've got this kind of deadly charisma, they're ruthless, they're often grandiose in nature. Now, not all of them have all those characteristics, in one personality type, but they share that pool of characteristics. And what's interesting to me is that those characteristics are often associated with what we might think a successful entrepreneur or CEO should have. They should have drive, they should have energy, they should have ambition. But what happens is that in a lot of these cases, that morphs into very dangerous personality qualities that threaten the life of the corporation and then can, threaten society and investors as a consequence. So I agree with you. I agree with your description. They're more rogue than lovable. I mean, I think the concept of lovable rogue was probably applied most directly to Alan Bond. And if you look at all the obituaries to Alan Bond when he died in 2015, that descriptor was very prevalent. I see Alan Bond, with a bit of historical perspective differently. I mean, I think Alan Bond is probably the most terrible example of a white-collar criminal that we've ever had in Australia. And he's a kind of warning that these kinds of characters can be drawn to run corporations. Of course, corporations in the modern world, of course, the people are so well paid, they have so much power, they have so much status, they become gurus, and they can attract quite dangerous people. And psychologists have been warning about this for decades. Now, I'm not saying every corporate leader that's involved in a scandal, is a corporate criminal. I'm not saying that at all. Some of them are, and some of them have a concentration of these dangerous qualities that put investors and society at risk. Now, in terms of Alan Bond, if we just move on to him a bit, as the lovable rogue, I mean, Bond stole from shareholders twice, 1.2 billion from Bell Resources. I mean, it was a corporate crime on a scale never seen before in Australia and probably hasn't been seen since. So the guy was a corporate criminal. By the way, he's got this intriguing background of a juvenile delinquent. And that never came through the sort of public commentary on him. Because what fixed Alan Bond in the public's mind, of course, was the America's Cup win. There's plucky from behind, daring do, heroic sporting event in a nation that loves sporting heroes. And you can't take that away from Alan Bond. He put the money up, he had the drive. I mean, all those characteristics that we just talked about, you could see funneled into the America's Cup and bang-o. As Hawke famously said, anybody who wants their workers to go to work on Monday is a bum, a national holiday. But the fact remains, he's a corporate criminal. And he got 3 years for the Bell Resources, and I've forgotten how much, but a lesser amount for stealing from Bond Corporation over the painting La Promenade. I think Bond exemplifies the dangerous characteristics of corporate leaders when they're not reined in by their boards.
Let's move on to another rogue. Medical practices fitted out with chandeliers, grand pianos, and a golden glow that extended to the gold-clad hostesses. People will recall the rise of the Geoffrey Edelsten super clinics, but it also signalled a rise in over-servicing or over-care. So what made it possible for Edelsten's concept to flourish?
Well, what made it possible for Edelsten to flourish is that he's a genuine entrepreneur. He came up with a groundbreaking idea, and that was to transform medicine from a cottage industry where previously most GP offices were in a front room of their family home with an old plastic chair, and you sat there, next to patients coughing and spluttering and couldn't wait to get out. Edelsten had this amazing idea that going to the doctor could not only be a really pleasant experience, it could be entertaining. And as you say, you put in gold-clad hostesses and little robots that dispense this and that. And he decked them out with grand pianos and so on and so forth. He put glitz, entertainment, and fun, I guess you'd say, into medical clinics in 24 hours, 7 days a week. The average GP doctor took Wednesday afternoon off. So he professionalised medicine, and you could argue that this was long overdue, but it was so new and so amazing to people that there's descriptions of people walking past one of Geoffrey Edelsten's clinics, with their nose to the window, peering inside, because it was all just so interesting and entertaining. But Edelsten just ripped Medibank off blind. He was famously outed in Parliament, in a parliamentary inquiry, as Dr. X. Dr. X, who was making absolute mint out of Medicare. So Edelsten had all these clinics. He had relationships with pathology providers. He was over-servicing in the pathology. He was overcharging in the GP side of things, and made an absolute fortune. And the sadness of it is that this great reform, Medibank, then Medicare, of course, by Whitlam and Hawke Labor governments, really had no means of oversighting rogue medical practitioners like Edelsten. There was just no system in there to stop this. Now, they tried and tried and tried and tried. They just couldn't figure it out. And of course, it still goes on. No one knows to what extent now, but I remember Adele Ferguson did a 7:30 report expose on it a few months ago and said it's still going on. So it's very hard to get really tight regulatory systems on universal government programs, and Edelsten just drove a truck through it.
I find this incredible. 2,000 years ago, the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder noticed that slaves who wore asbestos cloth grew ill and died. In 1957, Dr. D.L. Gordon Thomas in the Medical Journal of Australia established that asbestos and asbestos disease was, quote, a grave threat to life and health. 2,000 years ago?
Yeah. Look, James Hardie's manufacturing plants in Sydney, Brisbane and elsewhere, Melbourne, should have been shut down in the 60s, because the evidence was in, as you mentioned. The medical evidence was in by the mid to late 50s that this was causing mesothelioma and asbestosis, and it should have been shut down, and it wasn't. And you ask the question, how could a corporation get away with that? Well, the fact of the matter is, and this is one of the themes in the book, that Hardie's was an example of a corporation that could capture government. And the family that ran Hardie's at that time, the Reid family, father and son, they were scions of Sydney society, on all the right boards, on all the right philanthropic organisations. And basically, they were there advising the government on how to handle the asbestos industry. Just amazing. And so Hardie's, I don't think, shut down its asbestos operation until the later 80s. So 20 years of people getting sick when they shouldn't have. And the scandal that I write about there is how Hardie's in 2003, 4, 5 lied about all that.
It seems to be a shining example of the power of corporate denial and avoidance of responsibility, and pursuing a deliberate strategy to escape that responsibility.
Totally. And it's what I address as one of the big themes in the book, is the shameless lack of ethics that are behind all these scandals. Just an inability of corporations to have any kind of idea of social license, any idea of corporate social responsibility, and therefore any kind of ethics driving what they do. In the case of Hardie's, around the turn of the 2000s, Hardie's executives wanted to get rid of the asbestos claimants. They thought it was damaging the company's image. It was stopping them getting big loans. They wanted to expand to America, and this just all looked too ugly a stain on their reputation. So they wanted to deal with it. Well, that's good. But the way they wanted to deal with it was shameful. They were going to set up a medical fund. They were going to transfer the headquarters to the Netherlands, where they imagined they wouldn't be, that claimants wouldn't be able to access them anymore. They'll set up this fund, and then they got a deliberately low actuarial report on what the future liabilities were, and then lied that this was adequate for the future of asbestos victims. I mean, you're talking about people that are going to die, people tied to oxygen masks, people with families. We all remember Bernie Banton, who was leading the charge here, speaking through his oxygen mask. I mean, this was just a shameful example of corporate lack of ethics. And really the only thing they got pinged for was that they lied about the amount in the fund, not that they could rack off to the Netherlands and evade their responsibilities, or that a fund might not have enough funds in it for future liabilities. They said it was fully funded when they knew it wasn't. That's what they got pinged on.
You write that the implosion of HIH was Australia's most significant corporate collapse, and that the roots of that collapse lay with its CEO, Ray Williams, another charismatic leader. Given its size, what was the impact of that collapse on the insurance industry more broadly?
Yeah, HIH was Ray Williams. I mean, that was, that's been widely acknowledged. And the more I probed into his running of that corporation, I mean, he basically sets it up with a partner, takes it over, has a flawed business model to start with, that was never viable, that over the journey got papered over by crooked audits that lied about the company's financial position until it couldn't lie about it any longer. And so all that was going underneath HIH's operations. But Ray Williams, who ran all this, was, again, had the constellation of dangerous characteristics for a CEO. Autocratic, grandiose, imagined himself as an industry guru, wanted to expand overseas, wanted to take HIH to the world, demanded excessive loyalty, didn't want to hear bad news, way overestimated his capacities as a businessman. And the whole model was just crumbling for years. Journalists were writing about its financial problems. Joe Hockey, then finance minister, knew about it and went to HIH himself and came away, with the assurance from the company that everything was okay. The regulator knew about it, ASIC. ASIC later said that they admitted that they knew about it and did nothing. So again, just a massive failure of regulation, a massive failure of investigation. HIH, you get the impression, was just too big to fail. So nobody wanted to touch it. And when it did fail, it caused months of ruin for the Australian economy because nobody could get insurance. The whole industry collapsed until the government reassembled it.
Crony capitalism. You point to the state of Tasmania as the perfect breeding ground for crony capitalism. Is crony capitalism an unavoidable byproduct of a democratic system, and should we accept it as such?
Well, no, we shouldn't accept it at all because it's undermining the integrity of the democracy and is making corporations riskier, I think, because they think they've got the backing, they think they've got the backing and support of government when, in fact, they shouldn't have that in many cases. Now, crony capitalism is a symbiotic relationship between big corporations and government, so that both get favourable outcomes. The corporations get projects approved. Classic example is Crown Resorts approval for Barangaroo Casino in Sydney, all done as, behind the scenes, all done backroom dealing, lobbying, favouritism, etc. And governments get to spruik jobs and economic development, and then they can go on and get employed, by the very corporations they're giving favouritism to. And none of this, if it's managed carefully, breaches corruption rules because donations are legal. Politicians are perfectly entitled to have post-political careers. And so the whole system works kind of seamlessly for both sides. If it's pushed to the extremes like it was in WA Inc., then it causes scandal and investigation and inquiry. But often it just ticks over as a normalised part of government. And Tasmania, I've written about Tasmania before with the big forestry company Guns that wanted to impose the world-ranking pulp mill in the Tamar Valley. Yeah, so Tasmania's had a bad track record of this and still does with federal hotels, because federal hotels has been given for years a monopoly of casino and poker machine licenses in Tasmania, and they've just proliferated in Tasmania. The Farrell family emerged, quite quietly on Australia's rich list, worth $500 million. The public interest about whether gambling should have proliferated in Tasmania to the extent that it has just gone basically unaddressed. And so we have, a really terrible example, in my view, of corporate power run amok with governments basically ticking it off.
My final question to you, Quentin, is about regulation. We have deregulation, we have self-regulation. Is there a better balance to be found between government regulation and self-regulation of corporate life?
Yeah, look, I think it's probably more accurate to say what we've had in Australia over the last 30 years is light touch regulation. So we've got regulators, and the argument is the regulators go after the little guys, but when the big scandals come around with the big corporations, they don't really pursue them unless they have to. And so the question is, why are these regulators like ASIC and APRA too timid? Yeah. And in being timid, they continually send the wrong message to corporations that have got poor corporate culture, that you've got a pretty good chance of getting away with pursuing profits at all costs, even if you run amok and run into scandal, because not much will happen. And so it's a debate about whether the Corporations Act, I don't want to get too technical, specifies bad behaviour clearly enough, or whether the regulators are just too timid in taking on powerful corporations. I think there's an argument either side of that, but the bottom line is we have failed to have sufficiently tough regulators in Australia. You look at America, Bernie Madoff, running the Ponzi scheme, 20 years in jail. Jeff Schilling, who ran Enron, multiple years in prison. Alan Bond, 3 years. There's only a handful of these corporate executives and CEOs who've, in the string of scandals I write about, who have ever been charged with anything, and fewer still that have ever gone to jail. So clearly we've had inadequate penalties. Clearly we've had inadequate, tough regulators. And that's one of the reasons why these scandals have persisted.
Well, it's certainly a sorry tale, but it's a very interesting one. Quentin Beresford, thanks so much for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it.
I've been talking to Quentin Beresford about his new book, Rogue Corporations, Inside Australia's Biggest Business Scandals. It's published by New South, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. This Good Reading Podcast was brought to you by Book People Gift Cards. Share the joy of reading with a Book People gift card. To find out more, visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au.